Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon for those on the East Coast. Thank you for joining our webinar on business process optimization at MD Anderson Cancer Center. We're going to take you through a bit of what we did in terms of developing a solution for MD Anderson, the methodology we used, the systems we developed, and some of the things that we think really made a difference in our project. At any point, please feel free to use the chat panel. You'll see a picture of it now. It is on the left-hand panel of your screen. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We may not be able to get to them until the end of the presentation, but we will try to respond to every question. Today I'm joined by my colleagues from MD Anderson Cancer Center that helped us develop the solution. They were an integral part in challenging us to develop something that really was long-term sustainable for the organization and something that I think you'll find valuable for other organizations. With that, we're going to take a moment for each of them to introduce themselves.
Good morning, afternoon. This is Claudia Delgado, Executive Director for Grants and Contracts, and my office is responsible for managing all of the post-award functions for sponsored projects.
This is Peggy Dubos. I'm the IT Project Manager at MD Anderson and one of the project managers for this effort.
This is Laura Ganser. I'm the Director in HR Administration, and Human Resources is responsible for all personnel actions and position actions that affect pay and benefits. And so this, a big part of this project replaced some current functionality that we had.
Rhonda Reese, Director of Commitment Accounting. We handle position management and spending and retro changes.
Thank you. From here on, I'm joined with some of my colleagues that were very instrumental in getting this effort off the ground. I'm Elise Sparho. I served in both a project management and change management role on this effort.
I'm Jason Jones. I'm a technical architect, and I've been developing PeopleSoft solutions for over 20 years.
Jay Walton is not able to join us today, but he was an expert in HCM and workflow.
Hi, I'm April Williams. I'm the project manager over the NSCT project that we're going over today for HCM and FSCM. I have over 20 years of experience in human resource, payroll, accounting, and taxation.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Wolf. I was a project manager with Huron, and for the past 5 years I've been working on projects that are specific to commitment accounting and the integration of HR to financials functionality.
Thank you. Today I just want to briefly, for those folks who aren't familiar with Huron, mention that Huron is an Oracle Platinum partner, and we focus across several areas of the marketplace: education, life sciences, healthcare, legal, and financial. We also do a lot of different things at Huron Consulting Group. Our ERP service offerings span from implementations and upgrades to what we did here for MD Anderson was built a pretty amazing set of bolt-ons that will be able to be used going forward with upgrades or migrations to other solutions. With that, I want to have Laura spend a couple of moments telling you a bit about MD Anderson Cancer Center.
Thank you, Elise. MD Anderson Cancer Center is actually part of the University of Texas system, which includes both academic universities as well as health facilities. And we happen to be an academic medical center, so we train new medical professionals and grant degrees, as well as we're a significant research center, being the highest recipient of grants from the government for cancer research in the country, as well as inpatient and outpatient hospital services. We're one of the first 3 comprehensive cancer centers in the country that were created in 1971, and we have been listed as one of the top 2 cancer centers for the past 11 years. We are about 20,000 plus employees, mainly located in the Houston area, but actually throughout the state of Texas. So Peggy, are you going to tell us a little bit about
The technology?
about the technology that we're currently on?
Yes, so currently our HCM suite for PeopleSoft is on the 9.2 version, and for our financial systems we're on 9.1, but actually we're in analysis and planning now to move forward to 9.2 in the future. For People Tools, we're on 8.5.3 for both HCM and FSCM, but we are also in the planning stages to move to 8.5.4 for People Tools. And then, of course, our Oracle client is 12.1 and 11.2 for our finance. And I know this is pretty high level from an infrastructure point of view, so if any of you have any specific questions, if you would send them through the chat, and then we can probably get you those that specific information that you need after the webinar.
Thank you. The solutions that we've developed for MD Anderson have really evolved over time. Not a significant amount of time, but when we first came here, the thought was that we were going to develop one solution, and because it was so effective, we continued to create additional solutions for MD Anderson. I think one of the critical pieces for MD Anderson when they were looking at this, doing something different, is the fact that they were on legacy notes as their system for funding and personnel changes. The departments and the processing centers used this to make the changes, but it was a little challenging for them. It was time from the creation of a change to the time that it was actually recorded in the system could span up to 14 3/4 days, sometimes as long as 6 months. And that wasn't really a solution that they wanted to stay with. They also needed to get off of Lotus Notes. Lotus Notes was an archaic technology and really not robust enough for what they wanted to do. When they looked at doing something different, they realized that this duplication of entry and the long time processes were something that had to be reduced and removed in order to be effective. With the non-salary cost transfer tool, although it wasn't on Lotus Notes, it was an Excel-based spreadsheet that had up to 10 steps that the organization needed to go through. When you look at the timeline for what we delivered at MD Anderson, each of the boxes in color represent a chunk of functionality that we delivered. It was a specific phase of work for us. Most of the efforts took about 5 months. You can see that we did personnel changes and direct retros at the same time. Now, direct retros and cost transfers and budget retros, and there's a lot of terms used, and we know that not every institution uses the same terminology. So we're going to go over that a little bit more later in the slide. But these phases of work were sometimes done individually, sometimes done in parallel. And frankly, you know, when we first started the project, I'm not sure we envisioned that we'd be doing all this additional functionality, but it was really working well. We were very successful with the first phase of work, and we're able to build upon that. If you look at the chunks of functionality we have, in this presentation we're going to talk about them in 3 areas: things we did for personnel change, things we did for funding, and things for non-salary cost transfers. I'll just highlight a few of the different areas of personnel change. We're only going to show you one of them. We'd be happy to show you some others in person if you'd like. Just drop us a chat. But we covered most, if not all, of the personnel changes that the organization uses. In funding, we did future fundings, prospective, retro fundings, We did a combination of future and past funding. And for non-salary cost transfers, non-personnel actions, we were able to do mass transfers and single transfers. What I think was really critical for us is all of the validations that we were able to put in place within each of the areas for fringes, exclusions, and some things that are unique to grants and contracts. And across all of this, we did field level edit checks, chart field validation, and embedded a series of rules, which really helped to ensure the quality of the transaction that was going to be loaded into PeopleSoft. The approach we used, I think, was really instrumental in making us successful. And the approach was based on collaboration at all levels of the project, from the project management office, which you met some of the folks from MD Anderson that were part of that team, to the steering committee and working groups. Now, working groups was a pretty interesting concept that we developed that included representation from all the key divisions and processing areas across the organization, and they were involved throughout all aspects of the project. We had people engage the subject matter experts in the requirements and design of the solution, and really critical for us was the testing. We had our subject matter experts and our working group members test and exercise the functionality of the system. Folks were collaborating on engagement and communication, going out and talking to the organization about what the changes were, and in training. We did it together. We worked in tandem to create the materials and present information so that we could have our subject matter experts on policies and our technical folks in the same room to address any training questions. Our solution design, when MD Anderson was looking at options for replacing Lotus Notes and these clunky Excel systems, they realized that direct entry by the divisions and the departments into PeopleSoft was really not an option for the organization, because PeopleSoft, while a great system, takes too many screens and too much time to get through. So MD Anderson reviewed other options available, software vendors, and came to the realization that the best thing for them was to develop a custom solution that met their needs, that would be able to grow with them through upgrades and the transition if they chose to go to the cloud. Now, business process standardization is a school of thought that needs to be considered when going to the cloud. And really, there are two approaches. Some organizations standardize their business processes before going to the cloud, and some do it as part of the cloud implementation. I think in our case here at MD Anderson, with our team we had, standardizing the business processes upfront really paid off. We had a lot of iteration in our design, and I think that was very effective, especially when changing the whole method of how the departments and divisions use the system. And that was being able to give them visual presentations of what the pages would look like and how workflow would look. And we really kept reviewing and revising that with the organization as we went through the development of the solution. With system integration testing and user acceptance testing, what I think we did was create a foundation where we had the folks from our working groups and our subject matter experts in the system validating and rigorously exercising the solution with their data. We also did a really solid job of creating test scripts with expected results to ensure that we were delivering a solution that worked as the organization expected it to work, as opposed to how it was designed. So we really wanted it to be something meaningful to the organization. We had a few times where we revisited workflow, because that was one of the areas that, while easy to understand what it was, it took a lot of refinement for us to get it to a point where the organization really had it useful. I want to do a quick poll of our audience that's out there.
Are the results of a cost transfer, whether it's personnel or a non-personnel cost, at your institution accurate? And we have a couple different answers here. Never, almost never, sometimes, almost always, always, or not applicable. And I think this is really a great conversation point to start talking about one of the major pain points that I've seen at a number of institutions that are utilizing commitment accounting. And that major pain point is the need to enter cost transfers multiple times to achieve accurate results, or the inability to achieve accurate results on specific paychecks over large periods of time. We've kind of identified a number of root causes that can lead to errors when processing cost transfers. One of those root causes is if multiple direct retros are entered on a single paycheck in a single processing period, which can lead to a paycheck being pushed out of balance. And this is actually due to limitations with how PeopleSoft's delivered functionality handles retroactive transactions. This scenario comes up pretty frequently when using budget retro functionality if multiple users are submitting effective dated changes that fall within the same pay period for the same position, or with direct retros if we haven't built edit checks to prevent users from selecting the same paycheck multiple times. Another root cause is if there are any data integrity issues between HCM and financials. From an end user perspective, a retro transaction might be relatively simple. You enter it into the system, and a few days or a week later, it's processed to the general ledger. But from a technical perspective, the data actually has to flow through 5 different integration points, and if there are any gaps in that data, what otherwise would be simple addition and subtraction can lead to unexpected results. Finally, the last issue we typically see is the over-customization of retroactive processes. So anytime we customize a piece of functionality within PeopleSoft, there is risk that an error could be made. But specifically due to the complexity of retroactive processing, both from a business process standpoint and a technical standpoint, when we do customizations, we can often find that we get unexpected results after processing a retro to the general ledger.
So it looks like Chris said, almost always people are getting good results from doing cost transfers, and that's awesome. What we were able to do with some of the functionality in the solutions we developed for MD Anderson was to reduce cycle time from, on average, 14.75 days down to a little over 1 day. So that was a big gain for MD Anderson. I'd like you to think about that when we take a look at the solution and workflow and how long it takes your organizations to process cost transfers. The MD Anderson solution, just to give you a high-level overview, before we get into showing you what the solution looks like, all the personnel-related actions, including those funding-related actions to personnel costs, was developed in HCM. And we deployed a work center, which we're going to show you is a piece of PeopleSoft functionality that was really helpful in getting people to see where things were at. The non-personnel actions, specifically non-salary cost transfers, was located in FSCM. And as Peggy mentioned earlier, FSCM at MD Anderson is still on version 9.1. So while we weren't able to take advantage of true work center functionality, we were able to create something that looked pretty much like that. Security was role-based, and we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of roles we had available in our solution. At a high level, we had about 3 roles. We had an originator, which was given to someone who initiates an action, an approver, somebody who approves personnel cost transfer or non-salary cost transfer, and the final role was for a workflow administrator, a central office user, somebody who had to have a little more control over what was going on. As we mentioned in the overview for this webinar, everything was developed with PeopleSoft delivered tools, but we did do some additional reporting that seems to have been really instrumental in helping MD Anderson manage their business. And we're going to show you a little bit about that too. Workflow is a very easily understood concept. I just want to go through a little bit of how it was developed here. So in workflow, there are stages, and then there are steps within a stage. All steps in a stage have to be completed before it moves on to the next stage. I have a visual that I'm going to show you in a second about that. An originator, somebody who can initiate an action, can do a couple of different things. They can initiate it, they can recall it if they decide that, there was something that was done that they don't like, and they can delete it. Now, the person that approves the action can approve it and move it along to the next step or the next stage in workflow, but they can't do any updates. If they want to do an update, they have to deny the transaction. They have to push it back to the person who originally started it so that we keep some integrity in the intent of what the originator wanted. Both an originator and an approver can add attachment and add comments. And that's especially critical if an approver were to deny something, to say, hey, I'm not going to proceed with this pay raise change for this employee because I think it's not in line with what we're doing. They deny it, they push it back to the person that originated it. With work lists, we were able to show what was done, what happened with the workflow, and this is an example of that. And in addition to these work lists, we had emails going out to the originator on submission of an action and on final approval, and emails to the approvers going forward. You can see this screen is requests initiated by me. So these are actions that I submitted, and what you'll see is there are different types of actions, request type, a personnel change, a direct retro, an additional pay. Each is given a unique number. It refers to the employee name, which we grayed out for because of the sensitive information. It gives the status of the workflow, whether it's pending approval or complete, the ID, and some other relevant information. So this is where I can see for all the requests I've initiated, where are they at? Are they pending approval? All of these blue lines I can hyperlink into and check on the status. Workflow, and one of the reasons I think we were successful with the organization was rendered visually for the group to look at. So we would go through this and talk about what are the handoffs, what are the approvals. Now this is a very complicated slide to look at, and this is one of our simplest workflows. It goes through the different stages, the various steps in each stage that have to be completed before passing it on. This has all been coded in here. So where we took something that in the legacy system was a very manual process of figuring out who had to sign off on something before it was considered complete, we automated it, put the logic and the rules in workflow, and had it going forward. This is a more complex example of a workflow for direct retros, which Chris is going to walk through in a minute, that shows that we were even able to refine some of those criteria by fund group and fund type. We have another polling question coming up for you.
What % increase in efficiency do you believe your organization would gain from automating workflow and decentralizing funding changes? And here at MD Anderson, I think it's important to speak to the shift from the legacy system, which included the use of Lotus Notes, to using PeopleSoft and automating workflow. So in the legacy system, Lotus Notes was used by the department users to initiate changes in funding, direct retro changes, things of that nature. And then forms had to be manually routed from one department to another. So this involved reviewing the Lotus Notes information, looking at the chart field detail, the funding sources, and determining, does this need to go to the grants department? Does this need to go to a central office? Who's the owner of each funding source? And then either emailing that or manually routing that to the individual departments, which often led to confusion and some inefficiency in just moving the paperwork around the different departments. Ultimately, all of the Lotus Notes forms would end up with FP&A, who is responsible for doing the actual data entry into the system. This also had some communication gaps because the FP&A department had to interpret any comments that were entered on the forms themselves. Another one of the issues here was that we had resources in FP&A 100% dedicated to just doing that data entry. So by automating the workflow and rolling the functionality out to department users, we were able to free up a number of resources as well as eliminate communication issues, errors with where the forms were being routed, and ultimately this led to reducing cycle times for approval from 14 days on average down to 4 days on average. I also see that we have one question here asking how far back do we allow salary cost transfers, and the answer to that is as far back as we have data within the system. So I believe here at MD Anderson that's fiscal year 2013, and Rhonda is shaking her head yes, confirming that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. The MD Anderson solution is going to be presented to you in three parts. We're going to look at personnel changes, funding changes and direct retros, and then we're going to look at non-salary cost transfers. For purposes of this webinar, we're going to show you screenshots only because it's a little clunky to look at the online system over WebEx. I do want to offer this to you. If you're going to Alliance coming up in March, Chris and Rhonda will be there and can do individual demonstrations of the actual solution for you. If you'd like, you can also call us at the end of the conference and we can do one-on-one demonstrations. But in the webinar, it just doesn't work out too well. With that, I want to show you what the EPAF Work Center looks like. It is structured so that you can see your existing requests, where you can see what has happened. New requests are broken out primarily by the workflow structure that we used. You can check on the status of pending approvals, things that you need to take action on, and completed approvals in your workflow. And then we've added a series of reports that help the organization see what has happened with the different solutions and the different actions taken in the system. We also provided a series of links that we thought were helpful for the end users. With that, I'd like to have Laura talk a little bit about personnel changes.
Thank you, Elise. So as you see on this screenshot, personnel changes actually encompasses 13 different actions that you can do to a person or position. And we decided early on to use the key field of position number so that we could do actions both on people who reside in those positions or take actions on vacant positions that are active or activate inactive positions. So the end user, the originator, must have the position number and the effective date of the action that they're proposing. Once those are entered, they can select from one of the 13 actions, and then we made a decision early on in the project to create the workflows based on the actions. And that was kind of a key decision, not the action reason combination. The reasons then dictate some of the other things that need to be done or routing, particularly on that particular action. But the workflow itself, we had to chunk into things that made sense, and we chose to use the action as that deciding factor. As you see on that screenshot as well, there are empty boxes. Those empty boxes indicate on the screen that that's what needs to be completed to move forward with an action. And Elise, if you'll forward that for me to the next slide. And the next slide shows kind of the bottom of the page. The bottom of that page, we really designed it to mirror what our old legacy system had. So on the left you see currently what is being brought up from the system for that position number, the attributes of that position, and on the right is the proposed. So on the proposed side, you see at the very top, there are two little check boxes. It's hard to see on the screen, but one says backfill required and another says funding entry required. So there are position changes, for instance, or job changes that don't require funding entry, for instance, termination or retirement. Some of those are just simple changes. Others require funding changes to be entered. So the end user would be able to check that box and a new page would come up for funding entry so that they could enter changes in the funding source or the amounts, and actually all in the same action that they're taking. Again, you see on that page, the boxes that are open there indicate that it's asking for information. Sometimes there's a drop down indicated by the arrow or a little looking glass that would give you an ability to search for that information. So it's relatively simple for the end user once they've had some initial training, and we did require training because it's such a powerful tool, but it did allow them to quickly pick it up and use it and move forward.
Thanks, Laura. We have another quick polling question.
But the first question here is, does your institution reconcile payroll expenses between HCM and financials? And then our second question is, if so, do you encounter variances when reconciling HCM to financials? So this is one of the biggest requests that I've heard from a number of organizations, which is to have assistance with reconciling HCM data with the financial system that they're using, whether that's PeopleSoft or a third-party system. So one of the biggest problems besides issues with reporting and seeing variances in data when you look at reports in one system versus the other is that when we do have these gaps, it leads users to lose trust in PeopleSoft, which in turn leads to the development of shadow systems. So variances are often caused by a number of reasons, one being a lack of proactive reporting against the data source used for the funding entry page. So being very proactive in identifying expired funding or funding sources that are currently inactive and will not post to the general ledger can be a big step towards reducing gaps in data between the two modules. Another issue that we typically see is if cost transfer solutions have any sort of issues, it can lead to a scenario where a paycheck becomes out of balance. And when that occurs, the paycheck may become stuck between two integration points, the distribution tables and the accounting lines tables. And then finally, we often see that there may be a lack of communication between departments or a lack of understanding of how actions in one department impact others. So an example of this is if funding information has reached financials, but it fails to post to the general ledger. So financial departments often use the quick fix, which is to update that distribution information and then post the new information to the general ledger. But this, of course, creates a gap between HCM and what's on the general ledger. So while this may be a really swift way to fix the problem, in the long run, it compounds the issue, increasing the number of errors that occur with retro processing and the number of variances that you'll see when looking at reports from the payroll system versus reports in financials.
Thanks, Chris. You want to talk about direct retros?
Yep, absolutely. So the screenshot that we're showing right here is the very first page of the direct retro solution that we've introduced at MD Anderson. One of the primary goals when we were creating this page was to streamline the end user experience while providing an extremely flexible solution. So what this means when I say flexible is that we wanted to allow the user to be as broad as possible when targeting paychecks. For example, doing a direct retro for every paycheck within a single fiscal year, including paychecks from prior fiscal years, or being very narrow and targeting individual earnings codes within a single paycheck page. This functionality is really driven by a number of key fields, the first being employee ID, the second position number. You can use either one or the other. It's certainly not required that you enter both. And then also the pay begin and end date. Users also have the ability to enter department if they'd like to narrow the search results only to see a specific HR department in the results grid. They also have the ability to choose whether they want to include or exclude off-cycle paychecks using this checkbox on the right-hand side. Once this information has been provided, you can click the Search for Paychecks button, and then the results grid on the bottom portion of this screenshot is populated. So this results grid includes a lot of information from payroll as well as job data that can assist with identifying a series of paychecks that you'd like to redistribute via the direct retro. So information displayed here includes pay group, pay period end date, the employee ID and name, the HR department of the employee, their position number, job code, salary admin plan, as well as the total earnings, taxes, and deductions for each check. One of the things that I wanted to note is when you search by employee ID, it's possible that you will return results that include multiple position numbers. And when searching by position number, you're able to receive results that include multiple employee IDs. And 99% of the time, this is completely acceptable, and you'll be able to do a single direct retro that impacts paychecks that span multiple incumbents. There are a few restrictions that we have put in place, though, when it comes to selecting paychecks to be redistributed. If you're trying to select multiple paychecks that include key fields used in the mapping of key fields such as the GL account, job code being one of the major drivers here at MD Anderson, we would require that you enter a separate direct retro when doing these grouping of paychecks. And this is specifically to prevent the wrong chart field information from being applied automatically when you're doing large groups of paychecks at the same time. We also built a similar edit check where if an employee received a change in compensation over the period of time that is being retroed, we would trigger a notification to inform the user that this increase in compensation has occurred. Now, this is not a hard stop, but it's rather a warning message that's meant to be informative so that the initiator can then decide whether the distribution percentages that they want to apply to these checks is accurate for all the checks that have been selected. After this has been completed, the users can then navigate to, well, actually, there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about for search results, which is one of the major pain points in processing is if the same paycheck is being retroed multiple times within the same pay period. So on this row here that's grayed out, we can see that there is some additional fields that are noted. The exclusion flag, our in-progress EPAF number, and the EPAF originator, which includes the name of the person who's created that retro. So this edit check was put in place to prevent somebody from initiating a retro on the same paycheck multiple times in the same pay period, as this is one of the restrictions within delivered PeopleSoft functionality. If this scenario occurs, we often see that the paycheck is thrown out of balance and becomes stuck between the distribution tables and the accounting lines tables. So this is one of those big issues that can cause reconciliation items. So we simply don't allow that to occur in order to reduce the number of variances that happen within the system. This next screenshot is displaying the core functionality of the retro page. At the very top here, we can see the paycheck detail. So you're able to scroll left and right here to view all the information about each of the paychecks that were selected from the search results grid. Below that is our job information view. In this screenshot, it's collapsed, but you are able to expand this if you'd like to see job and position data relevant to the paychecks that have been selected. So information like compensation rate, salary admin plan, supervisor ID, as well as the employee name is all displayed here, preventing you from having to navigate to that job data page or position data page to get all of the information you need to successfully enter the direct retro. Just below that is our current regular salary summary. And I want to speak to a concept that was introduced here at MD Anderson, which is the all earnings code. So this view, it's showing you how the paycheck and every paycheck that you've selected is currently distributed. But what we've done is created this concept of the all earnings code, which actually represents every earnings code that would typically follow regular salary. This was done primarily because this direct retro functionality was rolled out to department users that were very familiar with the department budget table, where they would typically only enter funding sources for regular salary. So the users are not necessarily familiar with all of the financial nuances involved with updating individual earnings codes. So we essentially mimicked the way the department budget table would work to reduce the amount of effort that was required to create a direct retro transaction. However, if you were interested in seeing all of the earnings codes and how the paycheck was distributed at a very granular level, you could expand the view just below it, which is the current regular salary detail view. And then finally, towards the bottom, we have where we actually do our data entry for the new funding sources that you would like to apply to the grouping of paychecks that were selected. You do have the option of entering either a combination code or each chart field individually. You can also enter either the budget amount or distribution percentage. We do have logic built in place in this page to maintain the integrity between the combination code and each individual chart field value. So as the fields are updated, you'll see everything else relevant to it update automatically. And same thing with the budget amount and distribution percentage. As the distribution percentage is updated, the budget amount falls into sync, and as the budget amount is updated, the distribution percentage is calculated as well. A couple other things that I wanted to comment on just for the earnings portion of the direct retro page. We did include the ability to select the Fringe Exclusion flag. If this box is checked, we will then redirect how deductions and taxes are distributed to a separate funding source. This actually takes place as part of workflow. So if you are creating a direct retro that's going to have an impact on a grant, and you select this exclusion flag, when we route the form to the grants department, they then have the option of selecting a handful of exclusion groups which represent different funding sources. We also created a couple pieces of new functionality on this page, one being the retro effective date, which mimics effective dated functionality from the department budget table, and is specifically useful when you have a scenario where a grant becomes active in the middle of the pay period. So this functionality eliminates the need for the initiator to do math to prorate an individual paycheck. We also created a new concept as well called the apply to future functionality, which essentially allows you to update a paycheck that's already posted to the general ledger through the direct retro page, but also update the department budget table using the same funding sources and the same distribution percentage at the same time. So this eliminates duplicate data entry, prevents the need from creating a direct retro, and then going and creating a funding entry transaction using the exact same funding sources and distribution percentages. The next page here is where you would navigate to if you wanted to make a change to deductions that is different than how earnings are being distributed. So this most often is necessary if funding includes a grant where deductions or taxes are not allowed to be charged to the grant. So if this detail was missed when the initial distribution of the paycheck took place, earnings may be posted completely accurately, but deductions and taxes may need to be moved off of that grant onto a separate funding source. This page looks and feels very similar to the earnings tab, with paycheck information at the top, job information, as well as the current distribution for each paycheck displayed here, and towards the bottom is where you'd enter the new funding sources specifically for deductions or taxes. Navigating back to the main earnings page, we're now able to see what it looks like after the form has been submitted to workflow. So looking towards the bottom here, we have a visual representation of each of the workflow steps. In this particular transaction, we have to route to two different funding owners, so the owners of each individual funding source that were entered as part of the new distribution information, as well as to a central office. So again, this workflow it's 100% automated, it's built on logic, and eliminates the need for anyone to really think about where the form needs to go before we commit the changes. We did build a couple pieces of functionality that were specific to effort certification. If you are trying to do a direct retro on a paycheck that is more than 90 days in the past, and there is going to be an impact to grants, we do request that a grant certification form be filled out. And similarly, we trigger notifications if an effort certification period is about to close. So this bottom screenshot here says the certification period is closing in 0 days. So we've essentially empowered the grants department to control whether or not we are going to allow a direct retro to be processed if there's an impact on a grant for a paycheck that is in the past where the effort certification period has already passed. If this notification is triggered, we request that the initiator contact the grants department, and then they have the option of either opening that period or requesting additional information about why this retro is necessary, and it's up to them to make that determination. And lastly, here we have a screenshot of the grant certification form where we ask a handful of questions relevant to why is this direct retro necessary. So this is typical in most organizations, but also it does get people that are initiating these direct retros to really think about what were the actions that led up to the need for having to submit this direct retro? What can we do different in the future to be proactive and reduce the overall number of direct retros that are required in order to meet grant certification compliance issues?
Chris. That was a great overview of direct retros, funding changes. April, could you talk about non-salary cost transfers, please?
Yes, absolutely. So users will use the non-salary cost transfer when they have identified a non-personnel expense transfer. The need for this transfer could be identified while completing your department budget reviews, your award closeouts, account reconciliations, or other various reconciling processes. The non-salary cost transfer tool will help you move these non-personnel expenses from one chart fill string to another. Various fields can be populated to assist in finding the posted journal ID that requires the transfer. Once the search criteria is entered, a grid will populate showing up to 300 lines of requested results for your journal ID selection and transfer. So moving on to the request page, there is actually 4 sections that is listed on this request page. The first section is a snapshot of your selected lines. This section actually shows the details of the selected journal IDs for transfer. This is your from portion of the transfer. Any incorrectly selected journal IDs can be deleted from this section, or additional journal IDs can be added to this section by selecting the Return to Search section there. The total amount section keeps a running total of debits and credits for your transfer. The journal line section is listed where the details of your proposed non-salary cost transfer will be entered. This will allow you to actually do transfers or corrections for a department, fund type, business unit, project, activity, amounts, and also you can add in a journal line reference. Also, we'd like to note that you can do partial or whole transfers in this system. Users can also add in comments as well as attachments to help out with the approval process. Once the users have submitted the request, it will be sent through the workflow process for approval. Once final approved, the request will generate a valid journal and will system post. So now we're actually looking at the search and results page for your non-salary cost transfer. The general search page will provide several different choices that you can use to search for your non-salary cost transfer and what status it may be in. Once a field or fields is selected for search, the information resulting from that search can be presented below. The information provided in the search result can be reviewed further by selecting on your hyperlink. Once the hyperlink is selected, it will actually navigate you into your actual non-salary cost transfer where you can view the details of the cost transfer itself. Just wanted to kind of note here, the highlighted cost transfer is actually a completed, approved transfer that has been journal generated and posted into the accounting system.
Thanks, April. Chris, can you review reporting for everyone?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest considerations when building a solution that focuses on streamlining end-user experiences, how are we going to provide useful reporting information as well as easy navigation amongst the number of different pages that interact with different actions you can take within the system. So we accomplished this in a handful of ways. The first was creating a number of views within the work center that resides in HCM that houses all of the EPAF functionality. Some of the reporting views includes the ability to search for transactions that were initiated by the user, as well as requests that were initiated by anyone else within the user's department. There's also a general search tool that allows you to look by unique identifier, look for specific transactions such as personnel changes, direct retros, non-salary cost transfers, as well as identify where in the overall approval workflow engine does each transaction reside. So if you wanted to only look for transactions that are currently pending approval, you'd be allowed to do that. Similarly, you could search for forms that are in a draft or a completed status. And then we also developed a handful of custom reports. The budget history page is very similar to the existing PeopleSoft budget history search, but does streamline that experience a little bit. We also built a brand new table and report called the Direct Retro Budget History, which essentially combines the budget history information from the department budget table with direct retro data. And I'll be showing that in just a moment. And then finally, we built a personnel changes form, which is a consolidated report that includes all HR changes within one single reporting output. So that being said, I want to show you the main page for the direct retro and budget history table. This report can be run either by position or employee ID or by department if you'd like to look at things more holistically. You can enter a series of dates, so from and to date, and then when you click search, what actually comes out as the results of this report is a timeline of every funding change that has been entered in the system, as well as every direct retro transaction relevant to the criteria that you've specified. So ultimately what this is trying to show is every single action that could have an impact to funding for the individual position, employee, or an aggregate of positions within a department. It also prevents users from having to navigate to the department budget table and then also look at the review retro distribution page when trying to determine all the actions that have impacted funding for an individual position. Another really cool piece of functionality that was created as part of this report is the ability to drill into an individual paycheck and do a side-by-side comparison of the most recent funding change with how the paycheck is currently distributed. So in this particular example, we can see that the most recent change was a funding change, so it's a salary allocation change that's moving 100% of the funding to combination code ending in 324. That's here at the bottom hand side. Now at the top, we can see a handful of earnings codes and how each of these are distributed for that paycheck. And when comparing the combination code, we can see that the first three, LNG, PTO, and regular salary, have all successfully been distributed to the combination code that was specified in the salary allocation. WLC is a little bit unique. This is not an earning code that would typically follow regular salary, so that combination code is a little bit different. It's a different funding source here. Now the real value in this is that if a direct retro had been entered to redistribute this paycheck, instead of showing the most recent salary allocation, we would show the direct retro and what was the new distribution information. And doing this comparison, you'll be able to see whether or not that retro was successful, whether or not the funding entry was successful, and if there are any gaps between what you see for the current distribution of the paycheck and what is the most recent funding change. That would be a trigger for the user to then look into what was the cause for this to fail and then create a new direct retro to redistribute that paycheck successfully. Elise?
Thanks, Chris. We tried to show you a ton of functionality in a very brief period of time. Just to touch on some of the lessons we learned, testing was absolutely critical. We talked about the value of having our subject matter experts and working group in there. Standardization is really key. There were a variety of ways to do things in the legacy system, and we were able to get those processes standardized and make them more efficient and improve the quality. We learned through the process that we really had to spend some time and allocate time to talk through workflow, to make sure that we knew who wanted to see things and who wanted to approve things, and really continue to have it as an ongoing conversation. I think that helped us do a better job as we moved forward with the project. One of the things we did along the whole way of the project was capture metrics. So we knew early on how long it would take to do a funding change, and as Chris and I said, it was about 14 days. So we started tracking how long it would take for a transaction in EPAF to move through the system, whether it was in draft mode, completed, what the cycle time was on average. And this was really valuable for the organization to see that this investment in the solution actually paid off. So where do we go from here? Very quickly, so we can allow time for some questions. The EPAF solution and funding changes, direct retros, non-salary cost transfer, MD Anderson has some ideas of what they want to do going forward, adding free balance information to non-salary cost transfers, extending non-salary cost transfers to revenue costs, adding some more validation of salary caps. So they have some things that they have to look forward to. And for us at Huron Consulting Group, what we've done is developed a working model of these solutions in our Huron environments so that we can demonstrate it and take that as a starting place to implement at other clients. We are also working on a quick start methodology to take us through the questions and assessment to get clients started very quickly on the solution. If you're interested in more information, there will be live demonstrations of this at Alliance. We do have a couple of quick questions out there. One from Gina Trevino for you, Chris.
Yeah, so the question here is if a retro change impacts effort that has already been certified, do you go back to change the certification to align both? And the answer is yes. But I would like to comment a bit about this process because it's not just updating the information in the effort certification system, but rather to trigger the direct retro from HCM and allowing that detail, the new funding distribution to flow through the system. Here at MD Anderson, we use eCert for our effort reporting, which is a third-party system actually owned by Huron. And that information is, the funding detail is fed from PeopleSoft to eCert from the distribution tables. So by triggering the direct retro in HCM, we're not only aligning the detail within HCM and financials, but also with the eCert solution, which is used to manage effort certification.
The PowerPoint and the webinar will be available for people after this session. We do have a couple of things. If you're going to Alliance, there will be a demonstration, a walkthrough presentation of this, and Chris and Rhonda will be there to answer any detailed questions you may have. Also, if you'd like to just contact us and get some more information about how this solution might work for your organization or get another detailed walkthrough, we'd be happy to do that for you. Contact information is here for you to reach out to us. We're at the end of our session. If you have any questions, we'll still stay online to answer them on the chat, but we wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy days to spend some time looking at the solutions we developed at MD Anderson. We did this webinar because we really think that these things are going to be useful for a lot of higher ed institutions, and we welcome any questions or comments you have on what we've presented today. Thank you very much for your time, and we will look forward to talking to you in the future.